Onto the street. Father Bede Jarrett says, the truths of a generation become the platitudes of the next generation. Henrik Ibsen says, thought must be rewritten every 20 years. That is to say, eternal principles must at all times be presented in the vernacular of the man on the street. Emerson says the way to acquire the vernacular of the man on the street is to go to the street and listen to the man of the street. The way to become dynamic and cease to be academic is to rub shoulders with men on the street. This is another concept I've been thinking of in Catholic worker land for the past couple years, actually, is like, what does it mean to speak the vernacular of the man on the street? What does it mean to go to the man on the street? And like, do we do that well as a Catholic worker movement currently? Some folks will point out, like in the earlier days of the worker, the paper is more addressed to workers, it seems like. And even the first edition, they like infamously say, this is for you workers sitting on a park bench, you know, getting off your work shift at the factory or whatever, you know. And this is not an original critique that I came up with, but that like nowadays, who is our paper addressed to? It's like middle class donors, like here, or and some of that, and some of it too is just like, here's us sounding really smart about things. And I like to sound smart about things, and like clarification of thought is obviously an important thing. But like, are we doing it in a way that we go to the man on the street or speak a language that is relevant or real to them? And then like, where is rubbing shoulders with the man on the street? I've kind of been thinking about for the past couple of years, like the reality of like our digitalized world too. And I would agree with like every single critique of like our techno-capitalist world we live in, from like the material realities of like technical devices to the loss of real community and stuff like that. But the reality is that online and stuff like that is where ideas are more and more shared. The Catholic worker is like a pretty anti-technology in many ways, or it has been. And like, are we missing out on talking to the man on the street or person on the street, that we can start saying, though Peter didn't use the inclusive language? Or are we academics? Are we writing about nerdy stuff in newspapers? I mean, real newspapers barely are even into printing newspapers anymore, right? I don't know, that's like a lot of thoughts to go in a lot of directions there. But those are all things I've been thinking about for a couple of years now, actually.
Yeah, and I do think even definitely here in Milwaukee, we have a monthly newsletter. It is definitely written for white suburbanites. That's its audience. That's who mostly gets it. That's who we're writing to. The New York paper, I think the first, I'd have to look more closely to see when I'd change my judgment on this, but at least the first wave or arc of the paper, I think, was written for the man on the person on the street, and was hoping, obviously Peter and Dorothy wanted them to realize that there was an alternative to capitalism that wasn't communism. Mm-hmm. By the time you get to the World War II era, there's a lot of more academic type articles in the paper, especially on the issue of pacifism. which makes sense because they're taking huge, the Catholic worker movement and Dorothy are being hit with huge critiques of anti-patriotism, and that pacifism has nothing to do with Catholicism. I mean, during World War I, if you were a pacifist and you said as much, but you were Catholic, you would have gone to jail. There was no support. It was viewed as impossible to be a Catholic pacifist. So, so obviously their purpose of what they're writing and who their audience is, I don't think it's for the person. I mean, maybe it's for the person writing at the munitions factory, but I think it's during the 40s. I wonder if the paper is more written for, those true believers to kind of make them feel better or not alone, in wanting to be against an economy that's turned into a war economy. But anyway, yeah, so the paper definitely changes itself. Is it talking to the person on the street anymore? I don't think that was their audience at that point. But the other, I thought perhaps the reason that you chose this, and maybe it is, but we haven't really talked about it yet, is this notion that the truth must be restated. Ibsen says thought must be rewritten every 20 years.
Yeah. No, I do think that is true. And I mean, and we can kind of even talk, our earlier conversation about like, what is canon law, right? Like that doesn't play today to say canon law says this, and that's not an authority, though I can talk about it as in more vague terms. Yeah, I don't know. Do you have thoughts about rewriting it every 20 years?
Yeah, or I guess maybe just to touch base on the canon law again, which you've talked way much more about on these 4 essays than I ever imagined. But I wonder if one of the reasons he brought up the notion of canon law, I mean, it comes up not just in the one essay we read, but in many of them, is, these are so many Catholics during the 30s are still struggling with, how am I Catholic and American? And I think Peter really wanted to emphasize, choose your Catholic part. Like your Catholic part is what matters. He definitely viewed American law as what he would call the Roman law, to value property. And he's like, you have this tradition with the social encyclicals and canon law, but I think he really is trying to say, look at the roots of your tradition, and that's where the answer lies, instead of struggling so much with trying to get a second or third bathtub. But yeah, that idea with restating the truth, I did think it was maybe worth pointing out. This is, I don't know, maybe this is the academic in me, which, but every time Peter would quote someone like Henrik Ibsen here, I went and read it to put a proper footnote and who is this person. And Ibsen was a Norwegian playwright and poet, and wrote plays that revealed the pitiable reality experienced by families in society that were being ignored by contemporary playwrights. And where Peter here quotes, this is an example of him taking something maybe slightly out of context. So it's from an 1882 play called An Enemy of the People. And in the actual quote, the protagonist, a physician, states that a normal constituted truth has a life of no more than 20 years before it becomes a lie, at which point most people will accept it. So I don't know, I only bring that up to state that what Peter writes here really is not necessarily what the actual quote is saying. The actual quote is basically talking about how, I don't know, it's very down on reality and how people buy into lies. And but So, but just taking the quote at face value, I do think it's definitely important to be restating the truth. And where I think Peter would view the truth as perhaps more unchanging and just needing to be restated. I think maybe most of us Catholic workers today would state, well, not only does it need to be restated, but we have more insights that we need to make sure we address. Like Peter and Dorothy, especially when these are being written in the 30s, are, they're writing against capitalism, but not really adequately recognizing how much capitalism benefits off of, let's say, like anti-Black racism. So I think today, if our critiques of capitalism are to be meaningful, if we don't bring in some racial justice critique, then it just falls flat. So I think there's a restating of the truth, but also making sure that we're patching up holes in the previous restatements of those truths.
Sure, yeah. And, I've been chewing on this thought. I don't know that I have a real thesis formulated yet, but like in the world of like, and this isn't the real world per se, but of like online dialogue about the Catholic worker, there are sometimes like two camps of people. And there are ones who are like, Dorothy Day said, quote, this. And that is all we're going to talk about, is that Dorothy Day said this, quote. But there are other people who are like, well, Dorothy Day did say that quote, but there is also a Catholic worker movement who for 40-something years have continued to clarify thought and like reapply those Catholic worker principles and stuff like that. And that too is like, has authority or whatever. In my mind, it's almost like a Protestant biblicalism versus like a Catholic tradition. In some ways, it mirrors those poles or whatever we want to say. But yeah, just clarification of thought started with Peter and Dorothy, and we need to continue it is a real thing. And the situation is like so much different too than when this is written, right? Like some people say we're even like post-capitalist or something like that. Like there's been like a complete collapse of any kind of American dream. And like Peter and Catholic workers continue to critique it. Like Peter's farming stuff means something completely new in the era of climate chaos than it did back then, and it's still true and still is like maybe a foundation to build off, but we have to like restate it in a new way with these new realities, and like being in a union means something different now than back then, like in a country that like they literally want to close factories in the United States. Like try organizing that, so yeah, we have this intellectual tradition, but it is in no way can it be complete without further clarification of thought.
Yeah, I do. As you are one of the people who runs I forget if it's Catholic Worker Movement Facebook page or the Catholic Worker Movement Facebook page.
No, the
Catholic Worker Movement Facebook page. It does remind, you have this conversation in sound bites. I know I'll sometimes enter a conversation. I'll sometimes post something, but to enter a conversation with disagreements, I might put one small thing, but there's nothing you can adequately say to many to answer an argument on a Facebook post. And But in one sense, you could see, whether it's Facebook or Twitter, Peter Maurin's easy essays almost seem like they're written for this world.
Yeah.
So it's weird because on one hand, you have Peter writing things that seem perfect for the online world of Twitter or Facebook. But on the other hand, even Peter realized, well, I want to hold clarification of thought sessions where we get together for an hour and actually have conversations. Like realizing that just him spouting off some essays, that maybe, well, obviously he saw value in that, but it couldn't be the end of the conversation.
Yeah. I was doing one of our virtual roundtables we were doing last year, and got grouped with the fella whose name I don't remember, who started CatholicWorker.org. And when he was relaying that when he started that project, there was like all kinds of pushback against a number of Catholic worker communities. And he mentioned specifically Los Angeles, because I spent 7 years there in that community. But he talked to, I'm trying to remember, maybe it was somebody who was still alive who had known Peter at that point, who told him like, oh, if there was another medium that Peter could get his thought out on, he would be all over it. Like, oh, one more place where people can read the easy essays. Let's definitely start a Twitter easy essay account or whatever, yeah. I don't know. It is one of those, as you mentioned, weird dichotomies where it's like, in certain ways, I can clarify thought with strangers around the world, but in other ways, like, yeah, does a Twitter argument lead to real clarification of thought? I mean, I guess that's the difficulty.
Yeah, right? I feel more useful or more inclined where someone is like, oh, I'm interested in the Catholic worker movement. What should I read? Or like, what's a good Dorothy Day biography? Oh, I have thoughts about that. And they're appropriate for you don't want to hear my full thought. It's probably better that it's just like a response on a reply on a Facebook post, because I could talk like half an hour or more about why I prefer the biographies I prefer and the ones that I don't like, and etc. She doesn't want to hear that.
Yeah. I think also, going back to the man on the street, I think just like also it's a difficulty for the Catholic worker sometimes how few people, I mean, I guess we can talk about what is defined as like on the street, how like not too many Catholic workers come from lower than middle class backgrounds as well. And then, at least in my experience, and every community is gonna be on a spectrum for this, probably. Like, even though we're working in relationship to like poor people who maybe literally live on the street, if we want to go to there, it is in like a position of power generally. Even if we don't want to think of ourselves as an institution, like it's probably experienced similarly in many ways, though we hope better in many ways than like the person on the street. But also just like the difference between it being a worker and being like a Catholic worker is very different. Like having to go work for a boss during a pandemic who doesn't care if you have safety protocols or not. They don't care if you're sick. Like I was working at Target for 9 months a couple of years ago, and like I really felt like in the back warehouse room I could have like clarification of thought in different ways than like if I was a Catholic worker. I couldn't just be like, hey, I'm somebody from the Catholic worker movement. Don't you want to hear my critiques of like capitalism? Or is different than, oh yeah, we're So yeah, just going to the man on the street.
Did I freeze up, or you froze up on my screen for a moment?
Oh, you may have froze for a second.
I'm not sure which one of us is in the recording, you speaking or me watching. Maybe just if you want to restate like the last couple sentences.
Yeah, just the idea of organic clarification of thought being like a viable thing when you are not in a position of power, or outside of like a vulnerable position in the same way as in like if we were all working in factories with other workers or something
Yeah, and I think there is a point to be made about the makeup of the Catholic worker and the situation during the Great Depression in the 30s, where
like
so many folks coming to the Catholic worker that were running the Catholic worker were unemployed people. And Catholics at that point hadn't reached the point where they'd kind of I think, the integration of Catholics into society is usually viewed as more of a post-World War II situation, where pre-World War II, there's still a lot of discrimination, obviously discrimination much worse against other groups, but discrimination against Catholics, and that, and many of them are coming from a more impoverished background. And I mean, obviously you have those who are cops in New York City, but you have those that might be recent immigrants from Italy, or, it's a much different, it was a much different situation where I think you're right. Today, most Catholic workers are at least from a middle class background. Not always the case. I mean, but I'd say that's the norm, and it makes it much more difficult, and it would make me much less comfortable wanting to write something. I wouldn't want to. I feel like I have a place that's more appropriate to call out people from middle class suburban backgrounds, since it's more of, my bag. I grew up in a family where we never had to worry about food on the table, and my dad worked for the city and had a good union job. And, I feel more comfortable writing and trying to call those people accountable than folks in different situations where I feel I need to be doing more listening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I guess maybe this all comes back to just continuing our clarification of thought, and like the reality of one generation is not the reality of another generation. And I think more, even this is and I think even within like what I kind of consider the elder Catholic worker generation now compared to our, or the younger folks. I don't know if you want to, I don't know if I'm on the, where I am on the younger to older scale. You're a little older than me, but anyway, like it's a different world, like with different problems. Catholicism is less of a force. Folks don't really want to associate it with it for good reason. That I think like the way like money comes to the worker is going to change because of that, because like this generation is like poorer than the previous ones. And what will that look like? Will it end up looking more like the early worker, where unemployed college students, or just everyone is poor? More and more people are just poor. They can't own even their own house. um and yeah, and so maybe that's what a lot of what I've been thinking about too is like, I feel like something has to collapse slowly or quickly, or revolution slowly or quickly. And I think Peter, the Catholic worker, have some good thoughts. And like, how do we communicate all of those thoughts in this new time with a lot of potential? And I guess they lived at a time of potential too. Like they were speaking directly, I don't know if we want to say against, like a revolutionary communist movement was a reality in the United States and during the early worker. Um, So yeah, I mean, I wonder if we're not going to move into a time with more similarities to that generation, but well, obviously different as well.
Yeah, yeah. And where Dorothy, when she first became Catholic, still is keeping in touch with her communist and socialist friends, but after the Catholic worker movement starts and she's promoting another solution, she loses touch with most of them. Most of them don't want to return. Well, I don't know who stopped returning whose calls, but I know they weren't returning her calls if they were trying to call each other at all. It definitely drove a wedge through, I think, many of their relationships for quite a few years.